We begin with a CBC News exclusive. The Canadian Army has a massive hole in its budget and it's affecting the country's military capabilities. The CBC's Murray Brewster joins me now here in studio. So Murray, tell us about what you've heard from the Army and what's the significance?
Well, the Army has a gap in between the amount of money that it needs to maintain existing equipment and what it's getting from the government in the latest budget. That gap is $150 million. Now that is for existing equipment. When you consider equipment that may be in mothballs or close to retirement or things that they would perhaps drag out at an emergency, that gap actually goes up to about $260 million. It's a fund called the National Procurement. It is significant because it's used to pay for contracting, but it's also used to pay for the maintenance and upkeep of equipment. It's significant, and that funding gap is really important because the amount of equipment that the Army would need just for regular operations or even in an emergency, because what you're looking at is the serviceability of existing Army equipment right now is around 51 or 52%. That means roughly half of what the Army needs to do its job is actually serviceable. That means the other half is not. So those are pretty significant numbers, and it is a pretty significant funding gap.
Yeah, wow, 50% essentially unfit for service.
That is correct, yeah.
So the figures that you're talking about here are specific to the Army. What do we know about the Navy and the Air Force and the rest of the military?
Well, we're in the process of asking the Department of National Defense for more information on the Air Force and for the Navy. I would suggest that the numbers are probably going to be similar in terms of the gap. What's interesting about this is ever since the government started talking about an internal budget cut or budget cuts within D&D or budget cuts within the different departments, I have been asking the Department of National Defense, does this affect national procurement funding? Invariably, and I went back just before we came on the air to look at the 3 different statements that I'd asked, and in each of those statements the department said, oh no, we're going to make sure that they have enough money to do what is required of them. It's significant because the last time the Department of National Defense went through this budget cutting exercise was following the Afghan war. And between 2012 and 2015, the national procurement funding, the upkeep, was hit in a big way. And that meant at the time, ships were tied up in the dock. They couldn't go to sea. Aircraft couldn't go up for an absence of fuel. And you talk to people today within the Department of National Defense, and they say that some of that deferred maintenance from 10 years ago is part of the problem today that the Army is having, and the military itself is having with its equipment.
All right, let's leave it there. Thank you so much. The CBC's Murray Brewster. Appreciate your report tonight.
You're welcome.
Retired Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie served as Commander and Chief of Staff of the Canadian Army, and he joins me now. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much.
So Andrew, my colleague Murray Brewster has uncovered some data here that suggests 48% of the Army's equipment is unserviceable. Recent budget cuts have really hit maintenance and upkeep in particular. What's your reaction when you see a figure like that? Nearly half the Army's equipment unfit for service.
It all gets back to a question of readiness, and readiness is a function of how many people you have, how fit are they to go overseas or do whatever you wish of them, what type of equipment. Is the equipment in working order? Do you have enough money for spare parts and training? And what this means, of course, is that the Army is not ready to do that which the government said it should be ready for. But of course, the responsibility of this falls squarely on the shoulders of the government.
Yeah, help us understand when the military says that 48% of its equipment is unserviceable. What does that mean in practice?
Well, the armed forces are already 16,000 people short of their recruiting goals. This year, they're going to have less money to spend than last year. A war rages in Europe, and our allies are frustrated, increasingly angry with Canada for not meeting the 2% of GDP to be spent in defense that we've agreed to for many, many years now. So now when we need to do it most, the government has not fallen through on the deal they struck with our friends and allies in NATO, not only them, but the Americans, most importantly. What it means is that the Army is only about 50% of its capacity right now. That's why we're having trouble sending an adequately sized and resourced organization to Latvia. That's why we're down to 25 peacekeepers a year on UN international missions. That's why we're running out of troops to help with natural disasters.
I don't have to tell you why that's important right now. Obviously, we have the Russia-Ukraine war. A belligerent Russia is always a concern. There's talk of a wider war in the Middle East. And then closer to home, natural disasters are seemingly more frequent. Do you worry about the military's ability to really rise to the challenge if it's called on to do more here, at home, or abroad?
The military has a superb quality of individuals who choose to join its ranks, and they're literally willing to fight and die for us. So some of us are going to have to fight for them to make sure they get the resources they need to do the job adequately, which is the function of government. One of the most important duties any government has is ensuring adequate defense. And quite frankly, ours, through no fault of their own, are currently inadequate with old equipment, thousands of troops missing from their ranks. So the government has got to stop talking about fixing it and actually fix it. Why does it take about 6 months to put together a $10 billion electric volt plant in Ontario, but it takes 15 to 20 years to buy a warship?
Why isn't this more of a crisis point? Like, why are we not hearing more about this? I mean, if 50% of the Army's equipment, about 50%, is unserviceable, it cannot really be deployed at this point. Why is there not more of a sense of urgency in the government to actually fix this?
Well, you've put your finger appropriately right on the heart of the issue. Why isn't the government capable of spending government money on defense to make sure that the Army, their Army, which they've asked to do a variety of things, can do its job? And quite frankly, I think most Canadians aren't paying attention to the state of their Army. So the politicians in power currently aren't either, because they don't see it as an election issue coming up. I think it's time the status and the state of the Canadian Armed Forces became an election issue.
The government, they, when asked about these sort of issues, say that they are spending, more on the military than ever, in recent history. They've just budgeted, $73 billion over the next 2 decades for their Our North Strong and Free plan. And yet we see reports like this. Our equipment is in such bad shape. Why is there this disconnect? Why is the minister saying one thing and yet the military is raising some serious red flags?
Well, a lot of the stuff that you hear from government concerning their defense forces is spin, and they're very good at spinning the message. So yes, there's plans to spend oodles of money many, many years from now, but we're talking today. And right now, today, the fact remains that the Army has less than 50% of its vehicle fleet that can actually go out and do stuff. By the way, the Air Force and Navy have similar numbers, and their warships are older than the sailors, and the aircraft are older than the pilots. This is a national disgrace. And our friends and allies down south, the Americans, were very, very focused on defense and security, and then trade. They're our largest trading partner, and they've been unequivocal in their treatment of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense and others in pointing out their frustration and growing dismay about their lack of spending on defense, because there are predators out there and we're not doing our fair share.
You probably saw some of the comments from House Leader Mike Johnson, the Republican leader in the House of in Congress, south of the border. Obviously, Mitch McConnell as well, the Republican leader in the Senate. They were very critical of the Prime Minister when he was in Washington for the NATO summit. And after some of that criticism, Justin Trudeau came out and said, yes, okay, we'll actually meet the 2% spending target that's mandated by NATO and that's required of us as being a member of that alliance. But there hasn't been much of a plan yet released to achieve that goal. The commitment was hastily announced, if you will, at that summit. Do you think that it's actually achievable in the medium term for the government to meet that 2% of GDP spending target on the military, given what we're dealing with right now?
Yes, it is achievable if the Prime Minister and his cabinet members actually get serious about defense spending. Very often that same group will turn around and say, oh, the defense system is all screwed up and you can never buy anything. It's their system. And they can plan for, announce, and fund an EV battery plant for $10 billion in 6 months, but they can't actually buy any ammunition for their own soldiers. The disconnect is purely political, and our friends and allies know this. And by the way, all of them, with the exception of 2 other countries, so 29 out of 32, and the remaining countries are a lot smaller than we are, they've all managed to meet 2% without complaint.
All right, let's leave it there. Retired Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie, appreciate your time tonight, sir.
Thank you.